If this is your first webinar, or maybe you're a regular, or dare I say a veteran of many, if you don't know me, my name's Jeff Cowton. I'm one of the curators at the Trust and also head of learning. And I'm in the reading room of the Jerwood Centre. This is the building on site at Dove Cottage, if you don't know us. Dove Cottage, the home of William and Dorothy and Mary Wordsworth and their children, a place of important writing for Dorothy, for William, and a place now that has the collections, 90% of Wordsworth manuscripts in this particular building, Dorothy's journals, and as you can maybe see behind me, many rows of books, early editions of the Romantics, and a great centre, as it were. It's also a collection of Lake District art and travel books. People can see the treasures on site in the museum, but what if you can't? What if there are barriers to come into Grasmere? They could be health barriers, they could be financial barriers, they could be physical barriers, and maybe you're perhaps not aware of the existence of the place, and even if you are, maybe you just wonder whether it can offer you anything in particular. So what we're going to hear about tonight is how the people, the poetry, the plays, the collections move out of Grasmere and do good things in the rest of Cumbria and sometimes beyond. And to do that, that's where we're going to hand over to Susan and to Alison and to Tish. Partway through the night, we're going to sort of swap out and watch a video that Tish is going to introduce. Please do send comments and send questions and suggestions. We'll stop at about 8:45 maybe, and think about some of those things and maybe draw things together. And we'll also look at one or two artifacts on the way, which we've got in the reading room. So we've got a bit of swapping around. I hope it works. I hope the technology works. And I hope you'll enjoy and find something interesting from the evening. So to introduce folks, so Alison Critchlow is a British painter based in Cumbria, working from a studio on the Solway Firth. It's a wonderful studio. It's got the most amazing roof light. It's just full of light. It's a great space. She trained at Falmouth School of Art in Cornwall and has exhibited widely in Britain. Since 2017, she's worked closely with us on various projects, and she spent time in Dove Cottage garden painting. One of those, Alison was a dedicated soul. She wrapped up and she sat in the dark and the cold for hour after hour and painted what came from that. Anyway, it's very nice to have you with us, Alison. Thank you, and for what you've done with us too, and do with us. Susan Allen. Susan is one of our staff at the Trust, works in community outreach, often shared reading sessions, going around the county, giving talks, supporting group visits to Dove Cottage, as well as delivering creative workshops. She graduated from the University of Leeds. She taught American and English literature there before moving into community-based work across Yorkshire and Humberside, and ultimately returning to Cumbria. And Tish too. Tish is also a member of staff, Tish Thornton. She's our education development manager in a job share with Zoe. She works developing a variety of activities for schools and families, both on and off site. She's also a trained actor and a teacher, taught drama and English at schools in Greater Manchester and Merseyside for over 15 years, and has been running Kirkgate Youth Theatre in Cockermouth since January 2018, devising and writing many original pieces with the young people. So that again is going to be one of our focus for this evening, isn't it? So welcome all three. And I think Tish and I are going to sort of disappear, and we're going to hand over to Susan and Alison. So pleasure to welcome you both.
I think we were going to look at some of the artifacts that Jeff's mentioned, because really throughout the poetry and paint approaches that Alison and I have been developing over the last few years, the collection's been very much at the heart of things.
Absolutely. We thought we'd begin by looking at the project we did in 2017. It was the Weather Words.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I think if we could start with the PowerPoint, Jeff, that would be
really good. Yeah.
I know PowerPoint can bring dread into people's hearts, but we've actually found that using PowerPoints has been a really critical way into a lot of what the workshops and sessions that we've delivered, and we'll talk a bit more about that. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, this was our first image, which is actually a photo of Dorothy Wordsworth's journal when it was on display in the Weatherworths exhibition, which was a project we did in 2017.
Yeah, so some years ago now, obviously the journal's now in the newly refurbished museum, but the Weatherworths was a project that grew out really of a collaboration with the University of Leeds, David Higgins, Tess Somerville, who were looking at the impact of volcanic eruption in 1815, which led to the Summer Without a Sun. And we really sort of started to collaborate together on delivering community-based sessions. So long before we knew that we were working on poetry and paint as such.
Yeah, it kind
we
of
were doing it before we called it that.
We were.
Yes.
We were.
And the manuscript here, it was a beautiful starting point because there were some wonderful quotes, of course, in Dorothy's journals when we went out to meet with groups. I have to say that when we knew we were going to be looking at wild weather and what became the Weatherworths exhibition, Shap seemed a natural place to go to because they're notorious really for extremes of weather, but we also ran sessions in and amongst the Northern Fells villages, so we're working with people who perhaps had farmed or were farming, but we were able to take images along and the quotations, so much of the collection is portable and shareable in that way.
And this image particularly shows how we were looking for inspiration from Dorothy's journal as a starting point, partly what she'd written, but partly actually the look of the marks on the page, you know, looking at the way she crams all those thoughts in and the slant of her writing and the way the ink splots, and all of that became central to our approach, not to mention some of her brilliant weather phrases. So here's a few I love. A very dankish, misty, wettish morning. I love that. A soft rain, a miserable, clashy, snowy morning. Mild, misty, beautiful, soft. So I suppose we were automatically thinking she instinctively almost merges her headspace and her state of mind with the weather, and that formed a great starting point.
Yes, Alison missed out one of my favourites, which is A Small Rain, but I have to say, listening to those read out just then, we travelled through most of that weather on the way here to Grasmere earlier today.
Yes, we did. Could we move on, Jeff, please, to our next slide? Thank you. So this is an image of one of the first weather workshops we ran, was up in Oldale in the Northern Fells, and our principle from the beginning was, if possible, we should be working outside. So where they're allowed, that's exactly what we did. So you've got a photo there of some work in progress, and actually three images that were produced in that workshop. So we were very much looking at how you might express the feeling of the weather, and being quite experimental with the paint, quite free, trying to get over the idea of painting a view and rather painting something that felt a bit more fluid and a bit more natural, a bit more instinctive.
Some of the people that we attracted were already painters, of course, and felt very comfortable with that. But some people had maybe never painted or drawn since
some
school.
people never had picked up a brush.
And all throughout, we were trying to encourage people to maybe merge words and images. And some people did.
Some people really did. Could you move us on? We're going to show you a few examples of the work that was made.
Yeah, these are beautiful.
These are wonderful. So on the top there, you have an image made in one of the older sessions by Gill, and underneath a poem written by Felicity. And you can see we were playing around with how the words might sit on the page as well. And I think you're going to read one of the pieces that was written. So I think we found that the weather words provided a framework actually for people to express what were some quite traumatic experiences. So we were running these workshops quite, not so long after the Cumbrian floods, and for some people that had been a huge thing, and it had happened 2 or even 3 times for some people that they'd been flooded out. So, for some people, it really was a moment to reflect on that and share the experience, actually.
It was. And thanks, Kate. I mean, we were just really quite blown away when Felicity brought that sort of murmuration into the session. And it was lovely to be able to share it in the exhibition, which we had in the community gallery here at Grasmere. But Alison's right. a lot of the where the words literally appeared in this booklet, which was put together from sessions, again in Shap, with people who'd experienced floods, but had also got that very recent trauma, I think, of foot and mouth, and what that had, how that had impacted on their own lives, the lives of the community, and the environment, really, which people shared. But we thought we'd read just one poem from the collection by Sue Millard, called Flood. And this, I think, was interesting in terms of where we were and where we were running the sessions, because it's looking at an urban setting, really. So the Carlisle floods. Flood. We'd already put the sofa on the dining table and the baby's medicines in the buggy before Pete hammered on the door. Gore-Tex, hood up, heavy rucksack on his shoulder. Get out now, he said, my house is done. The water was a running skin along the street. By the time we pulled on boots, the river had taken the tarmac and pavement. We locked the door as though that was any more use than undelivered sandbags. You carried the baby, her nappies, our clothes. The buggy was wheels under. At the corners, oil-skinned men tensed, knee-deep in a creaming current. Take a hand each, go steady. There are rocks moving in there. 2 days later, we left the baby with my mother and we went back. Police had shut the torn-up street to prevent looting. We slipped with our keys indoors. The carpets floated on an inch of silt. The kitchen stools had waltzed into the living room and pitched like drunks into a corner to sleep. A bowl I'd left on the worktop sat half empty on insurance policies, welded to passports and papers from the filing cabinet. The fish tank, untenanted, cloudy with river water, at the turn of the stair, wailing on the last dry tread, the abandoned cat. And I think Sue's poem is fantastic in its own right, but in the context of the conversations we were having with people, the workshops seemed to provide a really natural way of bringing people together, knowing that it was a shared experience, even though their individual experiences of it could be, very different.
And sometimes I think articulating probably feelings they haven't ever really shared with people. It's really quite moving at times, I think.
Yeah, some of the sessions were definitely very emotional.
Yeah. Could we move on again, do you think, please? Yeah. So these pieces were made at Shap. So alongside the sessions we did in the Northern Fells, we ran some at Shap, which was fantastic. And some people chose to work from memory, which is what's happened here with Jean's painting. So Jean's made a painting of the Helm Wind, which is unique to Shap. I mean, wow, not many places have their own wind named. And I think a really great piece of work. I don't think she's done much painting.
No,
either.
She's a great writer, but clearly can really draw and paint as well.
Amazing. And could we move on again? We'll see 1 or 2 more pieces made up there. So look at that on the left. That's an image of, you can tell we're still working outside, but you can see the clouds massing. That's a proper Shap sky. Yeah. And on the right, that's Janet's painting. And you can see she was actually taking a half and half approach. So she was using an amount of observation and really trying to get to grips with how to mix colour, and then using, an amount of memory as well. Could we have the next one as well, please? Thank you. These were made in Shap as well. So you can see the approach we took in terms of the art was that I would take a load of books with me and images to sort of give some examples of how different people use paint and how you might, for example, paint a sky to really feel like an emotion more than necessarily how it looks. And so the approach was very experimental and very much the feeling that this can't go wrong, and if it does, you just embrace whatever it was that you were a bit surprised by. And people became, I think, really confident quite quickly. And you can see, some really expressive paintwork going on. And other people wanted to paint a view, quite often a place from their mind's eye, which I think was really lovely. And we discovered at the end of each session it was very important to have a period of time where we looked over everything that had been made and talked about it.
And the whole process, I think, of painting really fed into the writing sessions as well.
Yeah.
And you could see a richness growing out of that, really.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes when you're focused on mixing colours or applying paint, it does free up your mind slightly, so you're less worried about words on a page. And when you get to write, it's from a freer headspace.
What Kate's just said, I think, is lovely. About, picking up on that idea that things can't go wrong. We also took the idea very much that nothing would be wasted. So people, if they weren't happy with a piece of work, could put it literally into the centre of the table. And other people might pick it up and weave it into their own work as collage or as words to play around with. So that was really exciting. It really, I think, helped build people's confidence. And what was wonderful, I think, when people came to the opening of the exhibition, the Weatherwords exhibition, the people from Shap and Northern Fells had an opportunity to meet together, admire each other's work, and to share a reading of the poems from the Writing the Weather booklet, as well as looking at the images in the gallery.
Was it St Swithin's Day?
We did meet on St Swithin's Day, and it is safe to say that St Swithin's Day in 2017 was immensely wet. So
it was a great event, and for some people, I think the first time perhaps that they'd have work displayed in the museum.
Yes.
So, could we move on, please, Jill?
Susan, Alison, did you want to see the prelude next or the Ode to Rain next?
Well, we could see both actually. Could we see the Ode to Rain and then the manuscript? So the Ode to Rain, we should have mentioned earlier, formed part of what was in the Weatherworths exhibition. Oh, and it's just beautiful. I'm just going to show us.
So this is a manuscript from it's a Dove Cottage moment where Coleridge had returned to the area. He was upstairs in Dove Cottage and he was dying, desperate to see William and Dorothy, but he couldn't go down and see them because there was a guest downstairs that was kind of in the way, and this guest couldn't leave until the rain stopped. So we're back to that topic of the rain again that you mentioned, presumably not a soft rain in this case. And so Coleridge is upstairs and he seems to have laid his hands on some scraps of paper. And on these scraps of paper, here we go, he writes a poem. I don't know whether you can see that, Susan and Alison, but it's kind of showing. It's very, very faint. And I'm not going to risk reading too much of it out because I'm not sure I necessarily can. But if we look at the top line, I'm hoping that it's focused. And it's something like, I noticed I know my way awake, I guess.
It was wonderful having the chance to use manuscripts, facsimiles of manuscripts, not just in the Weatherwords, but in all the sessions as we've developed them. Because as Alison was saying at the beginning, it's that physical look of the marks on paper and the crossings out and the amendments. All of that seemed to contribute, I think, particularly when it came to some of the prison work, in the idea that you don't have to get things right, that things evolve.
And I love the fragile way, he's just used a pencil on little pieces of paper, and they're quite thin, and this you can just sense him sitting there with his pencil in bed being miserable about the rain. I mean, it's brilliant, really. Yes. It's like time travel.
It is.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
I ought to say to the guests to the webinar that we did before the program have a slight technical problem, whereas normally we would show this full screen. We had a technical problem about doing that, so I hope you can make enough of it in small versions. So I'm sorry, I apologize for that, but you do get a sense, as you're saying, don't you, of the pencil and the fragility and the moment, isn't it? I just love this. He's grabbed a bit of paper.
Oh,
it's written out these thoughts.
Yeah, it's brilliant. So we were going to sort of explain a key part of the way we structure these creative sessions is by looking at an object or a piece of writing or a whole process from the collection. So they always have an item from the collection at the centre, and this is a great example.
So we're moving on to the prelude, Alison, yeah? Is that right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So here is the prelude from the 1830s. It becomes the 14-book prelude by this point. It's already been worked on, if you like, since 1798, so what, over 30 odd years. And at this point, Mary Wordsworth writes out a fresh copy. So this beautiful writing is Mary Wordsworth, William's wife, if you didn't know. But at this point too, of course, there's still a lot of room for improvement. So imagine having written it all out. I mean, obviously they would know, Mary would know that there was more revision to come, but you get a sense of it's not just the odd word that changes. This is sort of wholesale lines, wholesale sections, and there are points at which there are so many changes. Well, you can see here. I don't know whether you can possibly make out these circles on the screen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Circles are the wafers that were used to stick this sheet on top of that sheet. So it's like a whole rewrite of that one page, and that's stuck on top, so that that revision there can be seen, if you see what I mean. So it's like, well, I mean, look at that page, for goodness sake,
Wow.
These are changes. So changes to the words. So lines change, words change, whole sections change, and in some cases, whole new pieces of paper are just stuck over the top and kind of let's just start again kind of moment.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Yes, that's just
that whole approach is really central to how we then structured the poetry and paint sessions. Was this idea that it was almost all about the process, and almost more about the process than the finished result. And taking literally a leaf from Wordsworth's book, that whole idea of sticking and pasting and crossing out, and embracing the fact that creative things don't appear fully formed and perfectly just like that. You need to view it as part of a whole process and a learning process. And so that's really at the centre of our whole approach. And do you think we could go back to our PowerPoint, Jeff? Thank you. Sorry, you have to change comments.
But even just those references there to Mary and to Dorothy, and that whole collaborative process here at Grasmere, that was very much part of the sessions that we were enjoying, really. That people did write collectively.
They absolutely did.
And we'll have an example of that later, I hope. So
absolutely. And here's an image of one of our poetry and paint sessions with the West Cumbria Carers.
West Cumbria Carers, yes.
I think that's the first time we officially called it poetry and paint.
Yes, we thought we would try something called poetry and paint because we had in fact been doing that. And these pictures, I think, are lovely. They show the fourth of a series of 4 workshops, day-long workshops. So it was really important for people to feel that they were able to make the best use of the time that they were carving out from other responsibilities, really. There were other people who joined the sessions, but the heart of that was definitely the West Cumbria Carers group. They'd heard about what we'd done with the Weatherworths, and you'd come along to see how they wrote a collaborative poem.
And they were brilliant.
And they were just such a natural fit for the first of what we were starting to call poetry and paint.
That's right.
So we'd had 3 day-long sessions at Cockermouth, and then for the final session, the group came and spent the day here at Grasmere, and explored the cottage, but the outside spaces as well. Really sort of was significant, I think, for people.
And we came up with the idea of a loose format, a framework, and part of that would be, as I say, basing this on an item from the collection or an idea. And another key part was to have a slideshow at the beginning of each session. And the reason for that was to kind of set the bar high so that we could have a brief look across art history and look at what other people can do with painting and with poetry. And that became a really important feature. Just images, you can see we've got 3 images here from the poetry and painting exhibition. So on the right, this was an example of some of the erasure poems that we made. That was an interesting way into writing poetry, I think.
It was, and that it worked really well, encouraging people who maybe were quite new to writing or fresh to writing. And it was a device that we tried when we first ran some writing workshops at Haverigg Prison. Didn't work so successfully there, but really here it did seem to sort of spark people off.
And you can see in the middle image, that's a display cabinet that we used, and we actually showed the process, the workings out, and where people were. You can see on the image on the left, the little stripe of crazy colours. that was these little tabs that we were using to just test out colours and marks and try things out. And they became, I think of that being almost a bit like chords in music, you know, they became these really experimental little things. And can we move on again, please, Jen? Thank you. And this is a large piece made on rice paper in one of these sessions. So we quite often use in those slideshows examples from across the centuries and from cross cultures, actually. And we've been looking in one session quite a bit at old Chinese scrolls, hand scrolls, and Japanese calligraphy. And you can see the influence in them. Really lovely free marks. And it's quite big, maybe 3 feet.
Yeah, it was. And there was a companion piece to it as well that Jane produced. Absolutely beautiful. But in amongst there, I can still see the ampersand, because that was one of my favourite sort of things when we were looking at the Wordsworth manuscripts. And that, I think, found its way into what people were producing. So.
Could we move on, please, Jeff? Thank you. These are a few more examples from those same sessions. Again, on the right there, you've got another piece on rice paper, which was made by Tara, which was a beautiful vertical hanging piece that had actually a poem written as well as painting, and the light came through it in the most lovely way. On the left, a piece by Michael, and he's not someone who'd ever done painting, and absolutely took to it. And 2 images in the middle there from Hilary, who's just brilliant, frankly. So really wonderful, but we also learned a great deal from those sessions about how poetry and paint could potentially be used in other settings. And actually our next setting proved to be Haverigg Prison.
It did. So, which we might need to return to after the break, which would work really well. But yes, I think the fact that I was certainly growing in confidence about what we could offer in different community settings. And it did come very much into its own, I think, when we took the work into Prison at Haverigg.
And so we've kind of discovered, I think, that the format has evolved quite organically, and with each group and with each setting, it's been a little different, but the bones of the format remain the same. And having that slideshow at the beginning has proved to be important. And actually, you'll hear later on, we took the format onto Zoom, obviously, with the pandemic.
Yes.
And the slideshow became the major part of what we were doing there. So we'll talk about that a bit later. But just now, I think we might, shall we go to Tish's film and then come back?
I think Tish is going to introduce the film. So that we'll be back.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Susan. That was and Alison, that was really, really interesting. It was interesting, actually, some of the words that you're coming up with in terms of collaboration and experimentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with the young people using drama to explore Wordsworth's poetry. I think, as Jeff said, I work at Wordsworth Trust, but as well as working there on the curatorial and learning team, I run the Kirkgate Youth Theatre, which is based in Cockermouth, and we did a performance of what we called Goody and Harry at the Cockermouth Live Festival in July of this year. So the young actors performed in Wordsworth House in Cockermouth, and also in the grounds of the garden at Cockermouth Castle. And what we did was we just took one poem from my older group. We looked very closely at the poem Goody Blake and Harry Gill and took this as our starting point. And in this poem, if you don't know the poem, you have a narrator who tells the story of Goody Blake, who is a very poor old woman, and she's caught by Harry Gill taking wood from his hedge, which he wants to use for fuel. So Harry Gill is a rich young farmer, and after Goody is caught by Harry, she essentially curses him, praying to God that he will never be warm again. And that's what we learned, that he never is actually going to be warm again. So he gets to feel what her circumstances are like. And actually, we thought that the young people, and I thought it was really interesting that he doesn't try to help her when she's cold, hungry. He just watches out to stop her from stealing from him. So what I've got is a 10-minute film to show you, where you can actually see the young people in action. They're performing some sections of their finished piece, and then there's also a little bit where they're talking about the process themselves and their responses to this Wordsworth poem as well, actually. And then I'll talk a little bit after the film about kind of why I chose to do that poem, and tell you a little bit about our process as well. But as I said, it very much kind of what Alison and Susan were saying very much resonated in terms, as I said, of the experimentation and the collaboration.
Hi, I'm Georgia. I'm here with Sebastian, who is a finance manager for an architecture consultancy. Ooh, good job, Sebastian. And I'm also here with Lily, a forklift truck driver. So, Sebastian, do you earn a lot of money?
Oh, why, yes, Georgia, I do.
And do you have a fancy house?
Oh, yes, I have a very fancy house, fancy car, and beautiful wife, 2 charming children, both privately educated, of course, as I was. Life is good and plentiful.
What do you think is the secret to your success?
Hard work.
How long did it take you to achieve the pinnacle of your success?
Oh, I'm not at the pinnacle yet. There's always more to get.
How long did it take you to achieve the pinnacle of success?
I was 21 years old.
What happened?
I got a job.
What can people do to be more like you?
If you don't have a job, get a job. If you don't have a house, get a house. If you don't have money, get money.
Is it really that simple?
Why, yes. I mean, we both have the same 24 hours in a day, don't we?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Lily, over to you, a forklift truck driver. Do you earn a lot of money?
No.
Do you have a fancy house?
No.
Children?
Yes,
And
too.
did they go to the local comp?
Yes, which is lovely. Can I just say,
Not really, no.
we might all have the same 24 hours in a day, but I don't think we have the same opportunities or start in life or connections.
Interesting. Back to
Because of where I grew up and my family circumstances, I wasn't able to.
Margaret.
We are struggling. Bills are going up, and I wanted to go to university to become a doctor, but I wasn't able to as my mum was ill and I had to look after her.
Aw, that must have been hard for you to give up on your dreams like that. Well, back to you in the studio, Margaret.
I thought.
If you've got blackberries growing on the side of your garden, who do they belong to?
Dunno. You?
Okay.
Them?
Oh.
Now Harry, he had long suspected this trespass of old Goody Blake, and vowed that she should be detected, and he on her would vengeance take.
And off from his warm fire he'd go, and to his fields his road would take, and there at night in frost or snow he watched to see his old Goody Blake.
And once, behind a rick of barley, thus looking out did Harry stand.
The moon was full and shining clearly, and crisp with frost the stubble land.
He hears a noise. He's all awake.
Again?
On tiptoe down the hill he softly creeped.
'Tis Goody Blake.
She's at the hedge of Harry Gill.
I think that new neighbours has taken some of our blackberries.
What, from our garden?
Nah, mostly on his side. But they're our blackberries.
Yeah, exactly. We should stop him.
I will. Next time I see him, I will.
Right glad he was when he beheld her.
Stick after stick did Goody pull.
He stood behind a bush of elder, till she had filled her apron full.
When with her load she turned about, the byway back again to take, he started forwards with a shout,
And sprang upon poor Goody Blake. And fiercely by the arm he took her.
and by the arm he held her fast.
And fiercely by the arm he shook her.
And cried,
I've got you then at last!
Then Goody, who had nothing said, a bundle on her lap let fall, and kneeling on the stick she prayed, to God that is the judge of all.
she prayed her withered hand uprearing, whilst Harry held her by the arm.
God, who art never out of hearing, oh may he never more be warm,
alcohol known above her head, lost on his knees. 'Tis Goody pray.
Young Harry heard what she had said, and icy cold he turned away.
He went complaining all the morrow.
He was cold and very chill.
His face was gloom, his heart was sorrow.
Alas, that day for Harry Gill.
That day he wore a riding coat.
But not to wit the woman he.
Another was on Thursday bought, and ere the Sabbath he had free.
'Twas all in vain, a useless matter, and blankets were about him pinned. Yet still his teeth and jaws would clatter,
Like a loose casement in the wind.
In Harry's flesh it fell away.
all seen him say 'tis plain. Let live as long as live he may. He never will be warm again.
Hi, I'm Harvey. I've just moved in next door.
Steve.
Alex.
I hope you don't mind. I've collected some of the blackberries that are on my side of the garden.
Yeah, we'd noticed.
They are actually our blackberries.
Even though they're on your side of the garden, legally they belong to us.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure. So I made a pie. I was wondering if you would like to come round and help me eat it.
Oh, right. That's very nice. Thank you.
Though I actually don't really like blackberries.
Oh, I'm sure I have something else.
No word to any man he utters.
A bed or up.
To young or old.
But ever to himself he mutters.
Harry Gill is very cold.
Eating. Inequality.
Trespass.
Owner.
Back.
Revenge. Compassion. Community.
A bed or up.
By night or day.
His teeth, they chatter still.
So think he found all, I pray.
Of Goody Blake and Harry Gill.
Justice!
You didn't kind of start off with a prepared script for this project, did you?
Well, first we got the poem and we read through it and we looked through stuff, make sure we understood everything, and then we sort of went through things and we got a big list of heaps of words that we could get from the script, like heating and eating and inequality and stuff like that, which we used in our script that we made later.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we got some of the pictures as well before we started getting the poem, and we had to kind of guess what it was about and act out the pictures and fit them together into a story.
And then what sort of scenes kind of emerged out of that in terms of making modern day things to sit alongside the poem?
The first one scene that we developed was the one with Sebastian and Lily, where two people kind of improvised and someone wrote down everything on the laptop and then that was edited.
And what part of the poem, it's written a couple of hundred years ago, so what was it within the poem that you thought kind of particularly chimed with things in the world today?
So the last word that we added on, so it started and ended with different words to do with the poem, so sort of themes. And one of them was justice. And at the end, everybody is very definite about that. And my character's not quite as sure about whether it was true justice. And I think it was interesting to look at how much people should be punished, or whether in fact they should be helped to understand society before they're punished.
Did working on this project kind of change your view or your feeling about Wordsworth?
It didn't really change my feeling about Wordsworth, but it changed a lot about personal views and how you should see the world and how other people see the world.
Did reading and performing the work sort of change how you thought about things in your life and in the world?
Well, I knew these issues such as inequality and land ownership. I've read about them and I knew they were big issues currently, but it was interesting to see how the same issues have been prevalent in society for many, many years, and it's not a modern problem at all.
Mm-hmm. Mixing in scenes from the poem and then the contemporary ones that you devised between you, how did you feel that worked?
I think it's quite interesting in breaking the rhyme scheme with the modern scenes, because often if you can get lost as an audience in a rhyme scheme and in a particular metre, but having the modern scenes brings them out of it and makes the audience think more about what we're trying to show them.
What did you enjoy about Wordsworth's writing itself?
I really liked that Wordsworth focused on people that weren't of higher classes. They were just ordinary people.
I think you get a mix in Wordsworth poems and Dorothy Wordsworth's journals, where some of it is sort of celebrating Cumbria and the beauty of Cumbria, and some of it's a good reflection of society, and it can be used as a first-person source for what people thought of society at the time, and how it impacted people, especially in the local area.
I'd like to be a Bush Junior. Right, we'll do a couple of run-throughs.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So these are my lovely, lovely people at Youth Theatre. So this is my older group. I have two groups, and the older group are aged, they were at the time here, aged 13 to 18, and absolutely cracking bunch of young people, quite a mixed group, all really, really lovely. And prior to the work that we've done with Goody and Harry, they'd been part of the I Am Dorothy project, which was run by the Kirkgate Arts. And for this, we had done 2 short plays looking at Dorothy's journals and Wordsworth's poem To a Butterfly, exploring the connections of the Wordsworths to nature. And it had gone really, really well. It was super interesting, sparking off lots of debate with the young people about environmentalism and their own relationship to nature. So what I wanted to do was to build on that exploration of the Wordsworths by looking at the 2 narrative poems, Lucy Gray and Goody Blake and Harry Gill, both of which appear in the lyrical ballads. And I was super interested in these poems, partly because I'd come across them in my work at Wordsworth Grasmere. So what I decided to do was I decided to look at Lucy Gray with my younger group, who are sort of 9 to 13 roughly. And I knew that was going to be a complete goer, because there was kind of, if you know the poem at all, there's a hint of mystery, there's kind of a hint of a ghost, and I knew that they would be super engaged. So that meant, therefore, that I was going to do Goody Blake and Harry Gill with the older group. And sorry about this, Jeff, but I thought, to be honest, that I was really worried that they were going to be a bit bored, and that they would think, like, why are we going to do this poem from Wordsworth from ages ago, and why is it relevant, and can't we now at last do something modern, and all of that sort of stuff. But actually they weren't at all, and I think in a way we were all really surprised in our discovery of how relevant the poem is today, and how interesting it was as well. So here in this slide, hopefully everyone can see this, we have got them all in action at Wordsworth House in Cockermouth. So for those people that aren't familiar with this, Wordsworth House is now a National Trust property, and it was where Wordsworth where William Wordsworth and Dorothy Wordsworth were born, and I think William left when he was about 13 after his father died. So we were super lucky to be able to perform there. We were meant to do it in the garden, but it absolutely chucked it down at the last minute. So they all had to squeeze into the dining room, but it was all absolutely fine. And you can see there, Goody Blake is the character there in the shawl and the mob cap. And then on the floor, you've got Harry, who's covered in coats and blankets. So this is from right at the very, very beginning of the poem, where Wordsworth kind of jumps straight in and tells us that Harry is never going to be warm again, in spite of having lots of coats and blankets and waistcoats. He just absolutely can't get warm enough. So there we had him at the beginning with all of these things on top of him. And the next photo, so this was obviously taken from the performance later on in the day, which was in the grounds at Cockermouth Castle, when the sun finally came out. So that was a relief. And here we've got the young man playing Harry, who's actually flinging off all of his coats, because this is the bit where Wordsworth is describing Harry Gill. And I think that this is the bit where he describes him as being a lusty drover, and who so stout of limb as he. And I think our young actor kind of quite enjoyed flinging off his coats and being stout of limb. I think as well, actually, it's really kind of quite interesting to note how well I thought that the poem led itself to characterization. So I think that the characters of Goody Blake and Harry Gill came across really, really clearly. It was kind of quite easy, I think, for the young actors that are playing those parts to kind of get their teeth into those characters. So I think you could get a real sense of who those characters were. So it felt in the end like a really easy poem to dramatize, actually. So I'll just move on to another little picture here and talk to you a little bit about the process of what we did. So we started off with, we did loads of drama exercises to start. And so one of those things that we did was we made what are called freeze frames with various titles. So the freeze frame is an absolute classic drama tool. So anyone that's done GCSE drama will have done freeze frames, I'm sure. So it's a frozen picture, just like a photo, and it communicates some sort of a meaning. So I gave them a whole bunch of titles, which I hope are going to come up on the screen now. So you can see there the titles that I gave them. So we had Cold, Warm Enough, Revenge, Justice, Inequality, Curse, and On the Edges of Society. And this is actually way before we'd even looked at the poem. But they were the ideas that I really wanted to kind of get them to tease out of the poem, and they did eventually look at it. So I did let them have a look at the poem in the end. So after a few weeks, we finally read the poem and discussed what life was like for Goody. We discussed kind of the idea of fairness and whether Goody was actually justified in her curse, and could either of the characters have acted differently. So I think you'll have, if you manage to watch the film, you'll see at the end, I got them all to turn around and they say that last word, justice. And we talked about how each of the people might have a very different way of saying it. But I think our young man that played Harry Gill said that his character wasn't really sure whether or not actually Goody Blake was justified in it. And then we explored the connections that we saw today, and they came up with things like land ownership, trespass, fuel poverty, the whole eating dilemma, obviously, blackberries, which if you've seen the film will make a little bit of sense, and I can come to later, and Ukraine actually as well. So Ukraine, because obviously they were interested in Putin's actions and those really big ideas of money and control and power and land. I was just thinking, I can't quite remember what this photo relates to, and actually Goody is looking very, very happy here. I think it might be a bit from kind of about a third into the poem, where it says that she's fine in the summer and she would sit as any linnet day. So at that point, obviously, she's not particularly cold. Right, so I move on to the next one. So this is a photo of the young actors being Harry's hedge, which Goody steals from. So there she is, kind of getting ready to come and steal from the hedge, which you'll have seen this little bit acted out in the film. And we thought that this idea of Goody taking from Harry's hedge resonated with a debate that we'd had in one of the sessions about the ownership of blackberries. So the issue or the point about blackberries arose because I have this really lovely volunteer, Jasmine, who works with me, and during one rehearsal, she just kind of said to me, do you know who do blackberries belong to if they grow in your neighbour's garden but hang over into yours? And this is because she just moved into a new house and her neighbour had blackberries that were growing in her garden. I think she really, really wanted to pick them, but she wasn't sure whether or not she should. And we kind of like this idea, so we put it into our piece, but then we put a bit of a twist at the end, because I thought it would be quite funny in our modern piece if the neighbours made like a real fuss about who the blackberries belong to, but then the owners turned out to not even like blackberries. But I also wanted to make the audience gasp a bit, you know, so it was kind of that idea that someone could feel such a sense of ownership or a sense of right to something from nature that they might not even want, might not even need, you know, and that whole idea of sort of nature being property as well. So I'm just going to move on again. We have a little bit of the hedge again there. So the modern scenes very much came from what they had improvised and wrote based on their chosen themes. And during this whole kind of development process, we decided to act out the poem then in its entirety. So we wanted to see all of the poem, but we wanted to then intercut it with the modern scenes that all these young people had come up with. So they're exploring their ideas of fuel poverty and financial and social inequality and the ownership of nature. And the two young people here you can see on the left I cast as Goody and Harry, and so they spoke a lot of the lines from the poem that reference Goody and Harry, and then the rest of the actors were either characters in the modern scene or, as you can see, a hedge. But then we also had them as storytellers using lines from the poem. And the bit that I think you'll have seen in the film, there was the section, the wholly modern section, with the forklift truck driver and the finance manager, and that was talking about kind of collaborative approaches. That was written by three, in fact, the three of the actors you can see there with their arms up in the air, those three at the front. So that was, and by Goody as well, the actress that played Goody. So that was written by them, but with input from the others. And something else actually to mention is that I purposely cast Goody and Harry. That was the same actors that played Goody and Harry that played Sebastian and Lily, the forklift truck driver and the finance manager as well. And one of the lines that one of the young people came up with that I really loved was where the finance manager says, "We all have the same 24 hours in a day, don't we?" And I think that was something that one of the young people had seen on a reality TV program that someone person had said. So obviously kind of that whole idea of the finance manager having no idea about other people and the pressures on people and kind of all of the factors that are involved in being financially secure. And I'm just going to finish off by showing, I've got 2 more slides, by showing you a little bit of the text. So this is a bit of the Wordsworth text, and as you can see there, we had it spoken by storytellers, 2 storytellers, and our character Goody, telling us about how it was so cold in the winter that she couldn't sleep. So it goes, "But when the ice our streams did fetter, oh then how her old bones would shake. You would have said, if you had met her, 'twas a hard time for Goody Blake. Her evenings then were dull and dead. Sad case it was, as you may think, for very cold to go to bed, and then for cold not to sleep a wink." So then we had that, and then we followed it immediately with this scene. So again, written by a couple of the young people. So really, really simple modern scene about a mother not being able to put the heating on during the day when she's working at home on her own because she can't afford it. And then at the end, there's kind of the inference that she's not probably going to eat that much that evening. So it starts off with the mum as the children come in from school going, "Hello, hi mum, how are your days?" "Yeah, it was fine, yeah mum, you look freezing." Oh, I'm fine, I just couldn't be bothered getting another jumper." "Oh, you're already wearing about 5. "No, she's not. I had a good day, except my feet hurt." "Oh, your shoes too small. When did that happen?" "They're fine. I'm hungry. What's for tea?" "Chips and beans." "Are you going to eat with us tonight, mummy, please?" "No, I'll have mine later." So, as I said, super simple scene, but very topical, I think. And on that note, Hannah, I'm going to hand back to you, or I'm actually going to hand back to Susan and Alison, I think. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Tish, and the young people. That was just marvellous.
Brilliant.
And, absolutely timely, which I think people have been picking up on in the chat. So I think this takes us onto what we were going to talk about in terms of the prison work that we did. Initially, the Trust was invited by the education team at HMP Haverigg in the south of the county to run some writing workshops, and we did that, and I would say to very mixed success, really. The most powerful session was certainly when we were joined by Nick McCullough, who at the time was our writer in residence. He just facilitated such a challenging, powerful session with the men who came, and that in a way planted the idea for me that it was probably more productive to try and run some sessions in the prison that were collaborative, and the natural person to talk to about that was Alison. So we put together a series of, I think we did 2 quite long days, poetry and paint sessions, that we ran in the prison. And Alison will explain this rather intriguing slide that we've got on screen at the moment.
So
thanks for that, Jeff.
To give you the context, we were faced with getting a group of men interested in poetry who were in the basic literacy group in HMP Haverigg. So you know, from the very start, that suggests that you're going to have a bit of an uphill struggle. And so it made sense to bring images and painting alongside the words and the poetry. And we chose from the very outset, we thought the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge would be the perfect poem to go with, partly because there's a great dramatic narrative. There's so much to talk about, but visually you can break it down into almost like a series of film stills, which is what we did. So we began, as we were saying before, we used our poetry and paint format, and we began with a slideshow. And as I was putting the slideshow together, I thought, we need to get their attention pretty quickly. And so I thought, okay, well, I want lots of Turner paintings in there because, you know, I want some examples to put it all in context, what was going on at the time. So I started with this image on the left, which is a film still from James Bond's film Skyfall. And it's Q and Bond in the National Gallery looking at a painting. I'm just going to briefly, I'll take you through 3 slides which give you the gist of the start of the slideshow we gave at Haverigg to try and catch these men's attention. So we started here, and I just said to them, so this is a quote from the film still. So we've got Q talks first. He says, always makes me feel a little melancholy, grand old warship being ignominiously hauled away for scrap. The inevitability of time, don't you think? What do you see? And Bond says, a bloody big ship. And that started our presentation, and that whole idea that different people can in fact see something different in a picture. And then of course we looked at the painting they're looking at, which is shown on the right there, which is The Fighting Temeraire by J.M.W. Turner, famous painting. And we talked all about the story around that, and in a nutshell, how really it's an image of this old heroic battleship from the Battle of Trafalgar being towed away to be broken up. And in a way, he's referring to the British Empire sort of disappearing and the steam age coming into being. Could we have our next slide, please, Jen? So we looked at a few examples, including actually we had, before we talk about this, we actually had other examples by Turner, and one in particular was his painting from 1840 of the slave ship, which actually led to, you know, amazing deep discussion about humanity and slavery and all sorts of issues that became very thoughtful very quickly. Actually.
Yes, it was astonishing, really.
Yeah, and alongside the next image we had was this Raft of the Medusa, again a very famous, iconic kind of romantic painting by Géricault, and the next one by Emil Nolde, which is a classic example of using a landscape for a psychological setting. So we showed a few of these examples just to set the bar high and grab their attention. And could we move on again, please, Jen? Thank you. So these are some of the paintings the men made. We broke the poem of the Ancient Mariner down into a series of film stills, and while they were painting, we were telling them all about the story and about Coleridge and about Wordsworth and about the lyrical buzz, and we were just having that as discussion. And as they got painting, well, you can see these men mostly had never tried painting before. Could you move on again as well, please, Jen? Thank you. So these are some of the images they made. Just to be clear, all of these panels are exactly the same size, and they were measured to fit along a long corridor in the education building in Haverigg. And by the end of that session, it was extraordinary. Susan read at the end of the session the whole of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner to absolutely rapt silence. I mean, it was extraordinary, to be honest. I think the prison staff were astounded, in fact.
It was amazing.
It was extraordinary. I mean, one man couldn't believe it when the albatross got shot.
Oh, that was so, it was very touching, but it was so shocking. I was reading the poem and I got to the point where, spoiler alert, the albatross is shot, and he hadn't heard the part of the discussion about the
shocked,
summary of
of
the
course.
plot, he was absolutely shaken.
Yeah.
And, you know, the other men in the room were saying,
"Oh, it'll be
it's
all
okay,
right."
it's okay. And he's going, no, it's not. And that idea that people were so caught up in, I mean, we'd chosen it because we thought it had such a strong narrative,
Yeah.
but it really did prove
Yeah.
prove its worth, I think.
And we did take a very dramatic, sort of cinematic approach to the imagery as well. So could we move on to the next slide, Jeff, please? So it's fair to say after that project, the education department in Haverigg were really excited by what we'd started there, and actually set up a poetry wall and named some of their education rooms after Wordsworth and Coleridge, and a third room. And they said to me, who's the third poet going to be? And I said, oh, and I gave them a few choices. So I'm not sure who they ended up with. It might be Southey or Keats, or I don't know.
Controversial.
Anyway, it's controversial. I won't go there. I'm not responsible. So this leads us on to a few months after that project. I was contacted by the governor of the jail to say it was all quite astounding, really. Those paintings that we'd made were still intact and on the education building walls. And I said, well, of course. And he said, no, you don't understand. They haven't been graffitied. Nobody's tried to pull them off the wall. And I wasn't surprised, but he really was. And he said, actually, that doesn't happen in jail. So he invited me in to lead the mural project. And I'm going to run you through this series of photos quite quickly because we're a little bit behind time. But if anyone would like me to send them a PowerPoint maybe next week that shows you this project in detail, please get in touch and I can do that for you. So you can see from these photos, the gist was to make murals as part of the education program. And so it was a 3-month project, and I went to the jail for three days of each week. Wednesdays would always start with art history and the slideshow, like from the poetry and paint. And I took the ideas from what we'd been doing with poetry and paint. So the basis, the theme of all the murals was the cycles of nature and the idea that nothing is static. And my remit was that they should be uplifting and inspiring, as well as having an educational aspect. So you can see on the right here, these are images of what they call observation flaps, which are the little, you can see them on the cell doors. You have these little flaps that are observation flaps on hinges. And I quite like the idea that you could zoom in and zoom out. So you could zoom in on magnified images of leaves or insects, because the nature of an observation flap is obviously someone gets very up close to them. And then we would zoom out in between. So could we move to the next image, please? You can see this is an example of one of the more images that was larger between the cells. This one painted actually as the men gained confidence. So some of them had never painted before. And so I was teaching them literally as we went. And then could we move on again, Jeff? Thank you. So this is a great example. This man had never, ever painted in his life before. And he became absolutely fascinated. So you've got two detail shots on the right, and on the left, an overall image. And then if you move us on again, Jeff. Thank you. You can see he got so confident that his tree grew up 2 stories. You can see it on the right there. And he was extraordinary. When asked for his, his release on temporary license was coming up, and he was asked what he might like to do in that time. And one of the prison staff had to seek me out and tell me that they simply had to tell me that he said he'd like to visit an art gallery. And the guy couldn't believe it. And I said, oh, I think he's really into this. And he was, that's what he wanted to do. And could we move on again, please, Jen? Thank you. So you can see perhaps here that our art history sessions every Wednesday, I would respond really to what the men were interested in. So we covered all sorts of periods of art, but we also linked it to history and to context. So on the left there, one end of this big cell block, we made into a sort of wooded bluebell covered area that was their idea. And on the right there is another painting, someone responding to some Sean Scully pictures that I've been showing them. So we talked about all sorts of periods of art, and actually sometimes the discussion became very thoughtful and meaningful, and I think massive confidence was gained by these men just knowing that they could actually learn to do something and really pull it off. Could we have the next one, please? Thank you. This is some details. So we have lots of birds flying around that room, and they all have a direction of travel, so they go clockwise. On the bottom right slide, you can see some tiny insects on the staircase. So we have lots of tiny little hidden insects and birds and mice and things. And at one point we invited the staff, the prison staff, near the end of the project to come and paint something on the staircase. And the men involved in the project taught them how to do it. So that was quite an interesting moment, in fact. And on the left, the bottom two, you can see colour theory was part of what I was showing them. So we would have lessons in colour theory literally on the walls. So, you know, I would teach them and they would try it out straight away. So it's very direct and very successful. And top right is work in progress. You can see we're looking at different types of painting. So could you move us on again, please, Jen? Thank you. And this just gives you the overview of that cell block. So the 60 cells in all, it's 2 stories. And before we began, it was absolutely grey and the bleakest of bleak. So yeah, a learning curve, and that's a whistle-stop tour, but it gives you a rough idea, I think. So could we move on to our next bit, please? Thank you. So then the pandemic came along.
It did, and it came along just in time to stop the celebration of the mural project.
It really did, yeah, which was a shame.
Which was a shame, and you know, it was very difficult in so many ways, of course, but we were curious and a little bit cautious, I think, about just how poetry and paint might be possible on online sessions.
Absolutely.
But we learned very quickly, and it seemed to work really well.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that someone who is a regular writer with the workshops that we do doesn't paint, doesn't draw, and I think joined one of the early online sessions that we ran, a bit out of loyalty and friendship, really, but was quite, I think, blown away by the fact that something that he thought might reinforce a feeling of isolation actually was the opposite. The fact that you could be in the session, have time out within the session to do your own work, but know you were in the company of other people who were working along similar lines.
That's extraordinary.
So that was very encouraging, I think, from the get-go when it came to it.
I think as well, because of the nature of Zoom, we realised it was important to have a physical connection as well, because everything was happening on screen. And so we used things like the format of old letters, for example. So Susan's got one here to show you how they're folded.
Not the real Goslar letter, but a treasure of the collection nevertheless. Someone once said in a session, a conservationist, that the crackle as you open one of these letters is just so exciting. And it really is. I mean, the Goslar letter itself is in the museum, but we used facsimiles of the letters in sessions that we ran in partnership with Eden, the Eden Community's big lunch project, and it gave us a wonderful format.
Oh, it did.
Of
Amazing.
oblongs and squares.
And each little package that you have can be drawn on or written on. You can choose to send it to someone or keep it, or some of them were written as love letters.
Letters to younger selves.
Yeah, I mean, they're so creative, and I think people really enjoyed that format. And actually, it's a way of really appreciating communication, and in context of a time when everyone was locked in, that became very important. And I always thought a brilliant thing to look back to such an old way of doing things on a digital format. It was great.
Yeah.
Could you move us on, please, Jen? Thank you. So we actually took a lot of inspiration from things like the Commonplace book here in the collection, which is very much about the everyday nuts and bolts of life, recipes mixed in with thoughts.
Yeah, how to make your own ink, and you know how quickly a toddler learns to walk.
Oh yeah, and also things like there's a dried flower book in the collection here, which belonged to Emily Fisher, and we took a lot of inspiration from that. You know, that idea of collecting things that are natural, but also taking the trouble to dry them and collect them. And alongside all of this, the slideshow element of our poetry and paint became super important on Zoom, because obviously it became almost the main thing. And so alongside items like we've just been mentioning from the collection here, I would often put in contemporary examples of art, just to kind of broaden the context really and make for interesting discussion. So on the left here, you've got an example which I've used once or twice by Simon Hydens, and it's an installation called Light Reeds. And these are amazing. They are digital reeds that link to sensors outside the gallery. So they respond to weather and sunshine and grow up the walls. Top right, you have Tacita Dean, which is her collection of 2, 4, 5 and 7 leaf clovers, which I believe is ongoing. And bottom right, you have an image from Ai Weiwei's installation of sunflower seeds at Tate Modern, in which there were 100 million handmade sunflower seeds, which is mind-blowing and has led to wonderful conversation. But just to kind of show you that we kind of weave in contemporary examples and quite a diverse range of art comes into the mix.
Absolutely.
Makes for great conversation.
Yeah. And things like the light seeds, which really, I think, took people's imagination.
Oh, they're so clever.
You know, but they correspond as well with, you know, Wordsworth's observations of the simplest flowers that he talks about in poetry, and Dorothy's own observations about seeds being scattered in places where the plants wouldn't normally be found.
Yeah.
So the connections were just lovely.
Oh. And could we have our next slide, please, Jen? Thank you. And these are photos of the wall outside Dove Cottage. The one on the left is the wall at the front of the cottage, which is just what an example of a living wall, and so much diversity packed into that little space. And the photo on the right is taken in the garden orchard, mossy wall. And some of our sessions, we built actually the whole workshop around the idea of a living wall. And there was a great poem which I think you need to read.
I think I do. We mentioned earlier about collaborative poetry. So this was a poem which the West Cumbria Carers group wrote, visiting Dove Cottage as part of the Poetry and Paint series. And there are references to Dorothy's journals and to Wordsworth poetry. But one of the members of the group said, living walls, all walls are living, which I thought was beautiful. So they called the poem The Living Wall. A nice, hot, sunny day, and the dragons arrived to play, landing like damselflies, wings spread out to dry, conjuring a fairyland, bringing the dry stone walls to life, with ferns, creeping toadflax, lichen and mosses, ants and millipedes, hoverflies and ladybirds, parsons' pigs and stag beetles, dandelions, honeysuckle, daisies and poppies, minds racing, mind altering, thoughts buzzing, whirling, spiraling down into dark thoughts, dark places, the warming heat of the sun, fiery, a fierce light scorching, jolts us back to reality, blackbirds whistling, swallows nesting, swift skirl, thrushes shout.
Could we have our last slide, please, Jen? Thank you. And this is an image taken in the session we ran just a few weeks ago at Dean with the West Cumbria Counts, and one or two new participants who were, I think, terrified at the idea of drawing.
One woman said she was shaking at the prospect.
And actually, how amazing was she? You know, once she got started, I helped her just because she was frustrated about trying to draw a tree that wasn't working terribly well, and so we looked at that again, and she made this amazing drawing. And she looked at me, and I just broke it down into something very simple, and she just said, "Wow, I've actually I feel like I've been shown how to look." And I think that probably sums up what these sessions do.
Yeah, good place to
come to end.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just thought before we concluded, I would mention one more project, if I may, if people will bear with us. This won't be long, and that's the exhibition that we've got on at the moment, and this is an exhibition of poems inspired by the 1798 lyrical ballads, the 23 poems in that remarkable book, and the poems have been rewritten by people living in northwest towns and cities who have experience of homelessness. And they've taken the lines, and it just inspired me from what you were reading tonight, Tish, the Goody, Blake and Harry Gill. And I just thought if people would just bear with me a little, and I might read the poem in here inspired by Harry Gill and Goody Blake. And it reads like this: it's also a combination of the thorn. Anybody who knows Wordsworth's poem, The Thorn. Ulcer in my leg won't heal. It's cold inside my bones. A mass of knotted joints I feel. It's cold inside my bones. I've got old bones, an old brain, peeling skin, rotting frame. I couldn't do another year by the thorn. I'm not as wicked as I was. It's cold inside my bones. Staying in's my only job. It's cold inside my bones. I've got old bones, an old brain, peeling skin, rotting frame. Keep away from certain types. It's cold inside my bones. Cut to pieces by the winter whites. It's cold inside my bones. The thorn, it pricks me through my skin. Its needle lets the winter enter in. And I am known to every star and every wind blowing me apart. And so that's one of many poems that deal with that lived experience of life living on our streets. And as someone from the Lancashire Homeless Support Group said to our supporters group last night when we launched this book, he made the point that we are 2 paychecks away from being in that position ourselves. So it's very sobering, but also really kind of enriching to read these poems, as the original lyrical ballads were. I made 1 or 2 notes tonight as I was listening. I wrote down the word conversation, because I love your conversation, Susan and Alison. It's almost like we've been privy to a private chat between the 2 of you, but also the conversations with the young people, Tish. They were great to hear how the poems of Wordsworth and the present day were discussed. I don't know whether I missed it, but did they go around to the neighbours for the blackberry pie, or did they not? How does the story end?
I was going to say, in real life, actually, yeah, I think yes, it was very, very similar. I think actually she genuinely made something and went next door, but I think the next door neighbours were grateful for it.
Okay,
so but I will double check that. But I think it had a happy ending.
I would like to think so. I also wrote down the word colour, because this has just been full of colour. How those prison cells came to life with the colour that you introduced. I've also written down materiality, how that's been the starting point of so much, as well as the poetry and the people in the place. And I also thought confidence. I think you mentioned about the people in Haverigg having confidence, and also the people who were terrified of painting and terrified of writing, maybe gaining that confidence. And it reminded me too about this, because when the authors, if you like, of these poems said that it helped their self-esteem and their confidence that they were worthy of their poems being published in a book. So that does count for something, as it were, in people's minds. And also that sense of that trauma, wasn't it, with the weather, the Storm Desmond, and how the weather could still traumatize people in time to come. I would have been one of those terrified by painting, I have to say. So I can sympathize with that. But I wonder if I could just invite Susan and Alison briefly to say something about the cards that we produced, where people can have a go, as it were, individually or with others to respond to Wordsworth and the theme.
Oh, the poetry cards.
Yes.
Yeah, if you could, I'm sorry I don't have one to hold up, but I wonder if you
know, it's fine.
But we have the artist. Alison illustrated scenes, episodes, extracts from Dorothy's journals, from William Wordsworth's poetry. And so it's a series of 13 cards, and each card has on the reverse a prompt or a suggestion about an activity that might lead to creating something, whether it's writing a journal entry, seeing if you can write a poem in the rhythm of walking in a landscape, all sorts of different things.
They're really creative. What I love about them is that they give you a prompt, a starting point, but they don't specify what the end result should be, which I think is really appropriate.
And they've been very successful. We've used them in groups where people have maybe taken an image that appeals to them and written about it, not even necessarily using the prompt. We've had other people, one woman who said that it was going to be her time. She was going to focus on one card a month for a year,
Wow.
and use it as her writing and thinking and reflecting time. And you just think, to create something that can be as flexible as that, I think is very, it's very significant.
I remember you asked Jeff for one illustration of a leech gatherer, and I thought, oh man alive, where do you find a leech gatherer? And so I had to come back to the collection where you have a painting of the leech gatherer and took my image from that, because, you know, try as I might, Google wasn't offering much up. So
I think another one was Simon Lee, wasn't it, where you needed somebody with an axe to chop the wood. But they are wonderful. And I think one of the things that's emerged from this too is that many of these projects anyway have been in partnership with other organisations. So you know, particularly say yourself, Tish, working with the theatre, working with North Wales groups, working with invitation almost to people who are listening, as it were, part of this. And maybe they work with a group, or they have a group, and they would like an activity, and how we can offer that kind of start. And there's a lovely example where we do things with a university in South Carolina, and their students, after spending time with us, go then back into their community. And in one instance, someone worked with a local hospital in which people with cancer were introduced to some of Dorothy's writings on a weekly basis. And that was a great comfort, and that carried on for 3 years. So these small beginnings can carry on. So it's kind of an invitation that I think we have someone from Germany, don't we, or San Francisco. If you're in that position and you would like us to help a start to people who you might know might work with families or groups, then we'd love to do that. This started with a conversation, you know, just a conversation in the cafe, and how things can kind of develop as we know. Just before we say thank you and close, can I just mention a couple of events? One is on the 19th of October in our Go to the Poets series, led by Kim Moore, the poet Holly Hopkins will be reading. So that's the 19th of October. We've got lots of family events for Halloween coming up. Look on our website for that. The exhibition, this wonderful exhibition, will be on until the end of the year in our exhibition room, and we will have a webinar